We're joined by Bill Hogan of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. You've been talking in Singapore at International Energy Week about the electricity market and the outlook for the market. But you were saying there's a lot of uncertainty going forward regarding climate change policy and so on. So what are the uncertainties?
Well, the uncertainties cover the technology and the structure of markets and the behavior of the people. The first is a process that's been underway for now a couple of decades of reforming electricity systems to rely more on markets and business models and competition. The second is the emerging or emerged green agenda of dealing with the problems of climate change. The electricity sector is important in that green agenda for a couple of reasons. One is that much of the CO2 and other problems that are associated with climate come from production of electricity. So we're going to need a major change in the technology and the way we use electricity. Secondly, in order to deal with many other aspects of climate change, such as the fuels used in transportation, one of the possibilities is to switch a lot of the transportation into through electrification as a way of providing cleaner fuels for transportation. The electric car could have a big impact on the electricity sector.
Well, we'll come back to the electric car in a short while, but just to stay on the theme of the uncertainty, because you were saying that even in 2029, you wouldn't be able to say for certain what the modes of behavior would be, or all the technologies, which sounds quite surprising.
Well, I'm pretty confident that if we were here in 2029 and we were looking back, that many of the solutions that emerged as being important and successful would be ideas that I can't think of today. And we need a great deal of innovation. I think we will get it, and I think there's a huge investment that's now being made. But exactly what that innovation is going to be is hard to know and hard to predict.
What would be your best guess, though?
Well, we're going to need cleaner sources of energy, so renewable energy of some type or another. But is that going to be thermal, solar, flourishing in the deserts of North Africa, or is it going to be solar panels on the rooftops of houses in California, or is it going to be wind generation off the coast of England, or is it going to be tidal power coming through the rivers, or is it going to be geothermal power that's in the subsurface, or is it going to be carbon capture and storage on a large scale that lets us use coal, and so on? And is it going to be smart gadgets on air conditioners, redesigned buildings, completely different public transportation systems, behavioral changes in where people live and how they live? There's a tremendous range of possibilities, and that's only the list that I can think of.
But presumably we'll see a combination of all of these.
I think we'll see a combination of some of them, and I don't know what there will be. Let me give you an example. Yesterday at the conference we heard discussions about what was happening in the natural gas market and LNG market this year. One of the biggest impacts on the LNG market came because of the massive expansion of the production of natural gas from shale, unconventional shale gas process in the United States. The United States had been expected to be a big importer of LNG, and now it's probably not going to happen. This is something which has happened rapidly, it has happened on a very large scale, and it was totally unexpected. And I don't think these situations are all that unusual. So I think it's a mistake to assume that we know precisely what we're going to do. We want to provide incentives. We want entrepreneurs to come up with new ideas. We want new products and new ways of doing things, and we want people to be rewarded when they succeed. And I think we'll find a great deal of innovation will come forward. But I think it would be a big mistake to design subsidies or pick winners or targeted programs on the assumption that we know the answer.
there must be a lot of opportunities then for businesses and entrepreneurs.
Well, in the short run, there is a huge governments that are trying to prime the pump, in essence, to stimulate these activities, providing support and subsidies for R&D, support for development of new technologies and testing and implementation of those things. And that's a phase that we will go through, and we'll be doing some of that for a long time. But more importantly, we're, I hope, eventually, probably not immediately, but soon, going to get some kind of limits on carbon emissions that'll put a price on carbon. And when there's a price on carbon, not just in Europe, but in the United States and in China and in Singapore, that's going to provide a very strong incentive for innovation and new green technologies that will transform what new businesses and what happens particularly in the electricity sector.
Do you think we'll see those sort of limits coming out of Copenhagen?
No. I believe it was, I didn't see the press story directly, but I think just 2 days ago the heads of state visiting here, including President Obama, said that they were not going to be able to fashion a binding agreement in Copenhagen, but they expected to have some statement about progress, and then perhaps next year, maybe in Mexico, when the next round of the COP meets in Mexico, some stronger agreement would take place. But I think it's too late for Copenhagen.
What do you expect to come out of Copenhagen, if anything?
Declared success.
But little else?
Little else.
But at least the US seems to be joining in
I think
the process this time rather than
the process is, I think it's working extremely well, and I think there's no question that the United States is committed to doing something. I think the attitude that's been expressed by many other countries, particularly China, is very much pointing in the direction of some agreement. I think we've reached a stage now where it's not a matter of principle. I think we're just negotiating, and that's a very good sign.
And it's a matter of time then as to
I think it is,
limits can be set.
The sooner the better, but it is a matter of, I think it's coming. I don't think it's there's any doubt that it's coming.
What about China?
Well, China is so central to this problem and so important that you can use them as the example for everything. China is doing major investment in developing nuclear power. China is doing major investment in wind power. China is doing major investment in solar technology. They're developing new transport systems, and they're building a new coal plant every week. So it's both the good and the bad, just because of the scale of China. So there's no solution without China. There's no solution without the United States. There's no solution to this problem without India. There's no and Brazil, and we have to get everybody involved in this. But I think the public expressions and the private attitudes that you hear from the Chinese are all pointing in the same direction.
At the start of our discussion, you talked about electric vehicles. Do you really see them having much of a future? Toyota have created a hybrid. You see Nissan doing research on this, but do you see a future in electric vehicles?
Well, I would be surprised if the plug-in hybrid doesn't become quite pervasive and quite popular, just because it's so flexible and it provides so many advantages. And it's a little more expensive, but it's not hugely more expensive. And just as I would be surprised if that was not successful, I would be surprised if the all-electric car is successful, at least outside of special applications, and particularly in the United States, any place where you have long-distance driving, because just the range problem. So providing today, with the technology we currently have, providing electric vehicles that meet the range preferences of households is just prohibitively expensive, and it just except for a few models is not going to be widely there. But a plug-in hybrid could make a huge difference. So.
And then you also need to have the infrastructure set up in a particular area for electric vehicles.
Well, it's much more important to have the infrastructure for the all-electric case than it is for the plug-in hybrids, because you don't have to charge as fast. It's not so essential. That makes it a little bit cheaper. You don't need the same size batteries. That makes it cheaper. You don't have to have the infrastructure everywhere, because if you get down to it, you can just use gasoline, and either when you can't charge or when you're going long distances. So it's much more flexible and much easier to implement gradually.
Your presentation here in Singapore was focusing on the electricity sector and the electricity market. Do you see a future for coal-fired power stations?
Well, this is my personal opinion. I have a hard time seeing a future without coal generation. So I think the relevant, simply because there's so much coal. So unless there's an amazing technological breakthrough that produces, we find some other way to produce energy that's cheaper than burning coal, the temptation to use it will be irresistible someplace in the world. And so I think the more relevant question is that can we capture the carbon and sequester it, and deal with that, the climate problem in some way, in a world in which we do use a lot of coal. And I think that's one of the game changers that we need, and exactly how well that's going to work and how successful it's going to be and competitive is an open question. But it's hard to imagine that we will not burn the coal. So if we don't have carbon capture and storage, it's hard to imagine how we deal with the climate problem, or at least a large part of it, if that doesn't work. So that's a critical technology.
What about nuclear power? There's a lot of talk about this being a clean form of energy. Do you see this making a comeback?
Well, certainly it's a great, it doesn't emit very much CO2, so that's a terrific. It does have other problems associated with it in terms of the environmental dealing with the waste. The volume of waste, by comparison to the volume of carbon that you'd have to capture from coal, it's trivial in size, so it seems to be a manageable problem. I think the problem with nuclear is there's partly the proliferation issue, which we worry about, and is in the geopolitical conversation. And secondly is the cost. It's just, it turns out to be expensive all the time. Maybe in principle it doesn't have to be, and I guess if you're French you can make nuclear plants cheaper than other people, but even the French are having cost overruns with the new plant. I understand it's being constructed in France, and the Finnish are trying to build one in Finland, and it's also suffering from delays and cost overruns. And I think that's a serious hurdle. And so I expect nuclear to be part of the portfolio. I'm not sure it's going to be a large part of the portfolio.
What about the importance of markets and pricing?
Well, when you're trying to stimulate innovation and you're not sure which technologies or which behavior systems are going to be the most important, so I think having efficient markets, having clear price signals, having the prices reflect the reality as opposed to something which is masked through the effects of regulation will be very important in going forward. There's a lot of talk, for example, about building smart grids, and a smart grid means many things to many people, but intelligence and information in the grid, smart meters that can keep track of consumption, smart devices that can use that information. But if you have smart grids and you have dumb prices, you're not going to give people the incentive to take advantage of the opportunities that are there. So I think it's critical that we improve the quality of the pricing models that we're using. And in the electricity sector, this is especially problematic because the traditional regulated model, the vertically integrated model, suppressed all of this information. And in fact, the cost of making electricity is highly variable. During the night it's cheap, and at peak loads it could be 10 times as expensive. And at one location it can be cheap because there's abundance and because of transmission constraints. Someplace else it can be 10 times as expensive. And when you have that kind of variability and volatility, you want to get that information and signal to the people who can respond to it, and that's what smart pricing means to me.
And just finally, you spoke about the impact of the financial crisis on the sector. What has been the impact?
Well, there's been the obvious effect of capital is harder to raise and investment is harder to make. And that's caused a contraction in the renewable energy business. It's caused the failure of some of these solar producers, and so but that's a capital-intensive industry in the midst of a financial crisis. So that's one thing that's happened. The second is that to the extent that there was an ideological and a religious dedication to markets as opposed to governments, the financial crisis has greatly undermined the belief and the arguments. And so there's a tendency to try to extrapolate that to all kinds of areas outside the financial industry. And so there is this balance between oversight from the regulators and exploiting markets in the electricity sector. I happen to think that it's a mistaken argument, it's a false dichotomy. In fact, the electricity sector in every country that I know of is highly regulated. And we have regulatory agencies, and we will, and we should. The trick is to design the rules for the markets under the auspice of those regulations so that we are supporting the kinds of policies that we actually want. And a place that does a very good job of that is, well, Singapore. So we see that here in Singapore, that the market design is quite sophisticated and seems to be working rather well, and it's not perfect. So they're thinking about ways of changing and trying to do it, but it's actually quite advanced.
So you're not expecting deregulation to come to the fore?
No, I think deregulation is a mistaken term. It's never been true. It's restructuring, and so it's changing the regulations to support the use of markets. But it's still in the dominant market design that's emerged in the United States. You still have institutions that are created by regulators, using market designs that are either created by or blessed by regulators. It's overseen in its operations to make sure that it's not being abused, and regulators are responsible for that. There's constant tension in trying to modify and improve these designs and modify the regulations in a way that's compatible and it meets these new policy agendas. So it is a restructuring problem that is continuing and ongoing. It is not a deregulation problem, and it's not a deregulation agenda.
Bill Hogan of Harvard University, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.